So with Tony and Phil, where we tackle tricky issues in learning design, and my goodness, we've come across some of those recently. So in this webinar, we've been looking at different persona in learning design, and this one looks at the cultivator. Now, Phil, how much is this down to your appearance on Gardener's World?
Very good. Actually, sorry to disappoint my many fans. I mean, no, my mum. That this isn't really a gardening thing at all. So yes, so we're talking about the cultivator today, which I know instantly sort of conjures up images of people, I don't know, tilling the soil and planting seeds. But actually, this is an interesting one because this is another one of those dimensions of our job that when we certainly began this job and started to think about sort of, hey, we come from a learning background. Hey, we're interested in education. Hey, we're going to sort of like, bring that out and we're going to leave the sort of HE space and we're going to go and sort of, leverage our skills elsewhere. I don't think there was no onboarding leaflet for some of the work that we've sort of figured out is absolutely key. So just a quick recap then. So this is sort of the third in a sort of a series of us sort of doodling and riffing on these sort of 12 personas. And these 12 personas are kind of like, I've used this before, but a bit like a peacock's tail, where when you think about how do you describe learning design as a kind of a function, how do you characterize it as a job description, you instantly start talking about sort of plural roles and different dimensions to that, which is like lots of people's jobs, I know, but learning design is a difficult one, I think, to give away. And so we sort of walked into that difficulty and said, you know what, in our experience of having looked across all the client work, we're beginning to see that there are certain roles that we have to sort of do each time. And if those roles are undone, then something goes awry. And so in week one, we were looking at sort of the sense maker, and that sounds kind of like very Jedi, but basically very pragmatically, it's about at the outset of a learning design project that the first thing you need to do is get your ducks in a row around language and around consensus, because there are hidden dangers in quick consensus, and there are issues with sort of collaborative working where it appears that everyone's sort of got a shared understanding of what employability looks like, and then you discover ultimately that in fact that understanding was itself a bit of a peacock's tail and nobody was agreeing really, but people were sort of just kind of like in that institutional vocab and just kind of like talking about buzzwords, and actually nobody understands anything about what the plan is. So that was kind of like week one. Then week two, we introduced the trust builder. And the trust builder, again, you could easily say, oh, of course we need trust. You've got to build trust to make anything happen. This was more specifically around how do you have good ideas with clients? How do you bring people towards innovation? How do you maintain, how can you be a change agent, if you like, as a learning designer? Because it always feels like that's one of the things that you're doing. And change is actually much harder to achieve than I think people assume when you talk about the word learning. Certainly our experience is that a lot of organizations that are in the learning space are highly change resistant. So the trust piece was really about how can you use language again for the learning people to walk into sort of into these different sectors, the commercial, the corporate, the HE, whatever it is, and bring people along. How do you build trust so people can experiment and take risks, and for the learning part to stay interesting? So here we now arrive at the cultivator. And again, this is another role that's sort of before the building of any learning stuff. This is sort of, when people think learning design, maybe they're thinking about people making slide decks or convening modules and thinking about the sequencing and like learning outcomes. But the cultivator, I mean, we are going to deal with that, by the way, but the cultivator is a sort of a role where it's a role that's come from not bitter experience, but real experience of the gap between finishing a piece of learning for someone, like being brought in to design and build. You hand over, and that often feels like that's the end of it, and that feels like a job well done. You've sort of enacted your responsibilities and you walk away. But our experience is that often that is not in fact the end. It's sort of the beginning of something else. So I've characterized that. So let me sort of talk to you, ask you a question, Tony, and say, in recent memory, When has the act, or indeed the art, of handover sort of revealed itself to be a more sort of complex and long-term relationship with a client? Can you think of a recent example where the handover's gone on for a long time, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we did a big build for a client which involved quite sophisticated use of scenarios, and we were lucky to come in on the start of that project, and it was all very exciting, and they were very much on board, and there was lots of co-authoring and backwards and forwards, and we did loads of work, and uh, it was all great, and the project was a success, and it launched, and it ran, and it was brilliant. But towards the end of that, we had to give it away. We had to get all the coaches and the people in the room and say, right, this is what we've built. This is what you do. This is what the learners are doing. Here's the documentation that supports that. And you end up running like a day-long handover workshop, and it's great, and everyone's on board, and some of it lands, and there's some good feedback. Um, but it's very easy to walk away from that and thinking, "Hey, job done, brilliant, that all worked," and then off you go, and then you come back a year later and you go, "Oh, hang on, you seem to have binned off half of that, and why have you? And but didn't we just? I thought we did a handover." And so, yeah, I think there's that was a good example of why assumptions are always dangerous. I mean, there's plenty of phrases around assumptions and where assumptions lead you, but I think there's two things that experience with that particular client and subsequent clients have taught me, which is firstly that there is an intrinsic relationship between learning design and teaching in terms of, and it's often the bit that you don't talk about. You've built something, but handing over involves you do have to teach someone what you've built. You have to teach them in a way that makes sense to them, in a language that they can get their arms around it, and that they can genuinely feel that they have ownership of it. And that is quite sophisticated. It's a quite sophisticated piece of teaching, which learning designers often aren't asked to do. But if this thing's going to fly, you have to teach the client. So there's that. But the other thing that I think I've learned coming out of that is that people will always tell you that they understand. And there's an ego part of that when you're working with the client, because who doesn't want to say they don't understand? So you've got to be really careful. If you say, right, so this is what we're going to do, you do the workshop, you hand it over, and the danger is go, do you get it? Do you understand what we're talking about? And they're like, yeah, 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 get it, really get it. And you're like, okay. And you can take that as a brilliant, I've done my job then. But actually, everyone always wants to say that they understand, because no one wants to admit that they don't understand. And particularly when you've got something quite complex and sophisticated that's a course or a program, and it's got methodologies and it's got assessment in it, it's a lot to get your head around. And there is a real danger in not handing that over properly. And you might have built this thing that's amazing. And if someone could run it based on how it was in your mind, it would be brilliant. But there's a huge amount of responsibility there to make sure that you give it away in such a way that someone else can pick it up and run with it in the way that you imagined.
I mean, in this way, it's different to, when I think about film, or I think about a novel or something where, you build this thing that's this experience for someone else that's highly complex, it's highly nuanced, it's sort of got these moving parts, but the experience of the audience is that it feels like a holistic experience. So if it's worked, it feels like there's the surface tension around that experience is unbroken, and that's how the novel has worked. It's greater than some of its parts. Now, the interesting thing about the tension that we've always experienced is that we are always seeking to produce that surface tension for the learner. So the learner who is moving through a learning experience, and that will be, I mean, the word experience itself is a bit of a blancmange, but an experience that's kind of convened out of modules and sequencing and activities and whatever, right? But the trick there is that has a surface tension. So the learner just feels held, it feels intentional, there's a kind of bit of uplift, they feel borne along by the sequencing. That's great. So in that respect, if you've done that right, the learner shouldn't be looking at all of the bits and bobs. The learner shouldn't be going, oh, I'm in act one of the learning experience, and now this is the point where facilitation is bridging me and scaffolding my learning. You don't really want your learner to be having that meta understanding of the genre that they're in, because the job of the success is to keep that surface tension. But that surface tension is a big problem for commissioning clients and organizations, because if they see that working, in a way, it produces this kind of cloak of invisibility about the mechanics. So you can have a program that's working, and perhaps that's because you've got staff who were there at the beginning, or you've got a particular culture in place. And then if any of those things change, it's like, well, why doesn't this thing work anymore? Like, what's happened? And it's because that sort of that other understanding, that kind of genre understanding of like the mechanics of the thing, were sort of buried under the success of it, right? So this was absolutely the dilemma we found ourselves in with the company that you're talking about, because we were then asked to sort of return, sort of, I think about, I don't know, a year and a half later, because again, there'd been some personnel change, there'd been some movement, and suddenly the existing cadences around transmissive coaching and like slide decks and sort of, workshops, they're all, I think they sort of had this, they carried something over of scenario-based learning. They were using fictional characters to sort of set dress, but the actual delivery method had sort of perhaps flattened out to something more transmissive. And you sort of realize that the big idea and the buoyancy and the risk had sort of fallen away. And the gap was revealed very quickly when we were asked to sort of go back in and sort of do some training. And then we had to reflect on just how much we had to give away. It was like, oh my goodness, we've got to talk about that. We've got to talk about the why. We've got to make the case for this. We've got to sort of surface and sort of all the backstage stuff suddenly had to go front stage. And we were asked back, and we ran sort of, I think, 3 distinctive workshops to sort of onboard people. And what was interesting about that was that we were then asked to sort of roll in the sales people and marketing people, because what became clear is that this pedagogy, like this sort of this set of decisions that we'd taken, because they weren't embedded in the organization, when they were out selling it, they were using some words and they were describing an experience, but it was kind of disembodied knowledge. It was sort of puppet knowledge. They were saying things, but when they then got a question on, well, why do you do it like that? It was like, well, we don't know really. We do this thing called scenario-based learning, but we sort of use fictional. We use fake people. Well, why do you use fake people? I don't want fake people. I'm trying to get I'm trying to get a real job. And you sort of realize then that we actually, in all honesty, had underestimated the breadth and depth of that part of the work, and that part of the work was work that hadn't been budgeted in originally. Because it was a distinct piece of work, right? And I think that's one of the challenges. It's like that handover isn't just zipping things up and emailing a set of documents, is it?
No, and you've made this point before. It's like it's not about the question isn't how do we hand this over. It's what does the organisation need to be able to do without us. So when you are not there, to what extent can you be confident that these people can actually pick this up and run with it and develop it, and that they are doing that from a shared understanding amongst them of what this thing is. And there is that, you mentioned marketing there, and I think that's from going back to our days in higher education, that was often a problem. You'd have a marketing team that was out there selling courses, but it had been quite a while since those people had actually talked to the people running the courses. And so already there was quite a big disconnect between what was being said about the course and what the course actually was and did, because that had evolved. So there's an interesting thing that came to me. We were talking about film as well. It's like you say, with a film, you write the film and the audience experiences it and they don't see backstage. But I wonder if there's something interesting around, like if someone writes a play, the idea is like you're writing a play in the knowledge that a director will have to pick that thing up and direct
It's much
it.
closer to that, I think. I think you're
And
right.
it will be different, because you would, directors interpret Shakespeare in different ways, but broadly, there is something about the narrative that is consistent, that has some room for creative interpretation, but broadly the story still has to work. And I wonder if there's something interesting there around not being overly prescriptive, because you still people need to feel that they have ownership of it. But how do you lay down the core of this story to say, somehow this message has to get across. This is what this thing is, and you can like dance around it and do other bits and interpret it and present it different ways. But broadly, if it doesn't do this, it's not the same story.
I mean, I think that's interesting, because obviously a script will have stage directions, and so and so exits stage left, and someone, what so on and so forth. And I do think that sometimes when people sort of think about, and we'll get more into this, in the later personas when we actually about like, what is the nuts and bolts of building for other people. But certainly that notion of having to be both front stage and backstage at all times. It's sort of like being in this liminal space when you're thinking about, and this is the thing, I suppose this is the big insight, which is that, you'll hear us bang on forever about empathizing with learners, because, without that active imagination, it's very hard to build anything meaningful for anybody. But I suppose what I wasn't prepared for was just how much empathizing you have to do with clients. And because, and this is a key thing too, which is that you've got to identify early on who in the organization is the best receptacle for the knowledge transfer piece, because it would never have occurred to me X number of years ago that we would be essentially creating a learning experience for a sales team or for marketing, which comes all the way back, I think, to the sense-making piece, really, which is about making sure that people have an agreed language that's bespoke to that organization, as opposed to some agreement that comes from buzzwords or comes from some kind of like generic template of understanding. So certainly with this company, it was so interesting when the founder, who was always an absolute champion of the pedagogy, always an absolute champion, totally enthusiastic, sort of like an early adopter of scenario-based learning, in that sense of like, oh, what is it? It's a bit weird. I don't know what it is or how it works, but I want it. It was so interesting to identify. He identified very clearly that it had to move beyond him and outside and move to sort of people who are in the sort of like the supporting functions of the company. So in terms of sales, but I also think some of the work we did when the money people were on the call, we now I think about those early calls with that client, and I would have done them very differently, because I would have known straight away that that some cultivation would have had to have happened where I think it didn't happen in those first things, because you can say a thing number of times and as you said, people nod. You can say scenario-based learning 400 times and people are nodding. That is not knowledge transfer, is it? So I think part of that is identifying who is the receptacle, who are you handing it over to? Because if you don't hand it over to someone, my sense too is that everyone thinks that someone else is going to remember it. There's that slight sense of you've got to be quite strategic about who's going to carry the knowledge over and who gets to be that custodian and that champion, and they sort of move it forward. And certainly with the founder with this particular company, we were always on the front foot there, actually, because there was embedded understanding there from the get-go. But I don't think that's always true, frankly.
No, it's not, and there is. It made me think of this idea of dependency. So when you're handing something over, there's always that danger that you're handing it over to someone, and that knowledge then lives with that person, which is great as long as that person's there. But how do you design in something so that you can hand over the actual course in a way that it lives irrespective of who's there, that anyone can pick it up without a person being there? And this idea of stage directions, I think, is interesting. It's like when you've built, I suppose, like when you've written a novel, you've written every word you want, you know the end to end. When you've built a course, designed a course, in your mind, you might not have gone through that course yourself, but you've built out the end to end. And because that knowledge lives within you, it's all too easy to assume that you've successfully given that vision, that image in your mind of what this course is, to someone else. And often course teams can't see the end-to-end experience. Certainly, ancillary people, marketing teams, sales teams, often they've got no idea what you're talking about. It's just it's an entirely imaginary experience. Even when someone's gone through it, it's all you've got is their understanding. You can't give away the lived experience of what this course is like. So I think there is something interesting there around how you build consensus, how you get people to learn by experiencing the approach. And this goes back to the workshop that we did with the sales team, where they were struggling to talk about the course in a meaningful way. And so you built a workshop for them, which was basically, let's do a scenario-based workshop so you get to experience what scenario-based learning is like. So therefore, you've got some muscle memory of what this thing is.
I mean, that was the key thing, because if you think about, again, I always think we have a laugh, don't we, sometimes about one of the sort of dark spots in you build a house and you budget for some lights and you light up the porch and you light up the stairs and you light up the living room and so on and so forth. And then you suddenly realize that you might need a light on the drive because people, and then you realize that you might need a light before the lights, and you suddenly realize, wow, do you know what? I didn't realize I need so many like landing strips to get people to
Into
walk
my house.
through the door. And I think that's the idea of how many landing strips do you need? The answer is you often need many, many more. And this cultivation piece is that, because it's and you're right to pick up on that specific example, that when we ran the workshop for people who were needing to sell and champion scenario-based learning in a highly competitive market around sort of skills accelerators, etc. We knew, didn't we, early on, that if you just say scenario-based learning, just say it, it would be the right vocabulary, but it would also be just buzzwords, it would be jargon. And so putting the sales team through a sort of a morning of training in which they were immersed in scenario, and they got to kind of discuss a fictional stakeholder, and they got to sort of, and you could see that was the landing strip before the landing strip. That was the landing strip before scenario-based learning.
Yeah.
You've got the pedagogy, right? And but so what? That's another ivory tower moment. It's like, so what? You've got this sort of this artifact, this piece of this word, and then you realize that actually, in order to turn that word into living tissue, you have to take a few more steps back and run an experience up to that word. And you think about, wow, so we've just had to like build a landing strip to some vocabulary so that vocabulary can become meaningful in other people's lives. And I think that sense of how much unfolding you have to keep doing if you're going to cultivate the conditions for a really exciting course to continue to be really exciting, I think is underestimated, and it's very rarely paid for as well. And I'm sort of, maybe I'm putting that out there and running a flag up a mast, but that idea that there isn't value or budget placed around the work that's a little bit like bedding something in, rooting it into the ground, because that's not something you can just kind of like pull out of your head. You need to find out a bit about the organization, you need to find out about the people, you need to find out about the blockers, you've got to find about the culture, and then you can run a training workshop that's not just more slide decks, but essentially you're talking about using the methodology to teach the methodology, and that's a key thing, because otherwise I think you just do this, you turn it into a best practice piece. You just say, this course is good because on this slide it says it uses scenario-based learning and because of blah 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 blah, and I literally think the needle did not move at all there, right? I mean, we certainly were able to create some really lovely eureka moments in some of those workshops where I really felt like people left, that the knowledge transfer had happened. Do you know what I mean? That it hadn't just been broadcast, that there was a bit of excitement in the room. And we all know that sort of things are entropic. We know that sort of there's a gravitational pull around things becoming less good than they were at the beginning. But one way that is guaranteed, that entropy is guaranteed, is if you just hand over a course and don't tell anybody what's in the black box, really.
Yeah, and that time aspect I think is really interesting, particularly in a good old AI accelerated world where, I imagine you need to sell something. It's like, just tell me what I need to do. I've got to sell this thing. I've got targets to hit. And actually to do that job properly, particularly when you're selling something as complex and as intangible as a learning product, which is basically an imagination piece.
It's an imagination piece, yeah.
Nothing, you can't get your hands around anything.
It's a holodeck, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it's like, welcome to this holodeck. Great. But in many ways, the only effective way that I can think of doing that is to get someone to go through that experience, because then you pass that muscle memory to them, because they have worked their muscles on the holodeck. You haven't just told them there's a holodeck with some great stuff on it. They've been there, they've had to respond to some challenges, and they've gone, oh, it feels like this. And I think, as AI now, you've got so many words all over the place. And it's almost like it pushes you out of that. I've got too much to deal with over here, but actually you just need to take the time to have an experience of this so that that's how you give it away. If you're just talking to people about it, you've got no way of evaluating whether they've actually understood anything. It's got to understand is such a problematic learning outcome, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, because it seems to be so literate, doesn't it? It seems to be so incisive,
Yeah.
because that's the goal. Understand.
But there's also that idea of this idea of teaching people to fish as well, which is often counterintuitive. And
commercially, it's
commercially counterintuitive because to give this stuff away, you shouldn't be needed. You shouldn't have to be in the room. You should be able to just give it away and people can run with it. And if you are needed, then in many ways you haven't done your job properly because
and that is exactly right. I think that's one of the I think we've done this a bit, haven't we? We've talked about sort of we know that there in terms of business models there are help desks, and there are sort of models where you monetize against dependency. Right now, I think I don't want to sort of put that all in the sort of the big villain bucket there, because I think dependencies can come from change, disruptions, and sort of they can come from new spaces, right? They can come from new spaces, and so the idea that you are a safe pair of hands, which I think I'd agree you and I are, that we're a safe pair of hands, and we work for a client, they meet a disruption or they come up with some blue sky, and that dependency is not based on you and I having withheld information. It's coming from the fact that they're a safe pair of hands. So to me, the idea of a help desk based around being a safe pair of hands is a different thing to a help desk based around the fact that you have willfully kept things as a black box. So people are indebted to you, and that their success is linked inextricably to your ability to turn up in the room. I certainly think that I think there are, I'm sure there's whole modules in business schools that talk the opposite of what I'm going to say there. It's a bit like make sure that you kind of give this, but not too much. But my view really, and this has been borne out by a project we did for an online provider, where I took it almost as a point of principle that I would ask in those early scoping questions about this short course they needed, this 10-week short course. I wanted to find out how courses went to die. Like, what was it that killed off their courses? What was it from a kind of because they have a small learning design team. It's like, what breaks their hearts? What whizzo idea from sort of an external consultant lands with them, and it's got all the bells and whistles. It's like this gorgeous looking thing. But when they look at it, all they see is a massive white elephant. They know that, so a great example of this, and we've talked about it. We know there is good underlying sort of engagement around video. We know that, in terms of TikTok and all that, we just know that video is sort of like, is a thing. But I also think for, if you were looking at handing over a learning product to an institution that has to QA and has to sort of refresh and has to go through all of those things, handing over a project where a lot of like videos are kind of locked in and they haven't really been thought about, because the person on the video is naming lots of proto-obsolescent material, like the video suddenly becomes this whizzo resource, right? This extraordinary thing that drives engagement, but they cannot use after year 3 because the person in the video has just named a bunch of things that are no longer relevant. And and we'll get into that much more when we talk about building and thinking. But upriver from building is that moment you think, I've got to hand this over. And I'm handing this over to a group of other professionals where the shelf life of learning products we know goes round and round and round quite fast, because technology changes, because institutions change, because frameworks change. And you and I have come from a space, I don't know about you, but when we worked in HE, I don't think a year went by when a huge piece of work that I had done the previous year had been rendered obsolescent by the next VC's big brain idea about, I tell you what, we'll go to 15, 20s and 30 credits.
New credit framework.
I mean, and I think a lot of that drives this sense of that our job description, that our 12 personas include this one, which is about handover. I think that is probably a war story
Mm.
coming from higher education. I don't know if you would, what if you would agree with that, but like seeing the acceleration and the entropy and the amount of work and effort in handover that then is instantly a white elephant sort of like a year later. I personally find that so, I think I just find it a bit depressing in a way, you know.
Yeah, it is, and it's a very responsible question to ask, and it's often not one that a client will ask you because they, as are most businesses, trying to solve a short-term problem, and often most clients can't see beyond 12 months. And certainly, again, with this, the intangible nature of learning products, they just think, I need this thing to build this thing that solves this problem now, and 12 months is a long way away, so just build it now. And the responsible question that a learning designer must ask is, well, in 12 months' time, how much of this is still going to be relevant, and how easily are you going to be able to update this thing without having to come back to us? Because obviously we want you to come back to us, but not for the wrong reasons, not because we built in a bunch of dependencies that you've now got to come. Maybe we're just not commercially minded enough.
No, I think that it's to do with waste. It's to do
Yeah,
with waste.
exactly.
I think if you and I could tick a box around sustainability, and sort of thinking about waste, I think this cultivator role, this is the persona that is, it's a self-serving persona on one level, because I don't know about you, but I personally do not want my great big brain to be endlessly returned to slide decks.
Hmm.
I don't want to be the only person who can change the wording on a slide deck because it used to say framework and now it says, I don't know, module scheme. Or I sort of think that learning design, you can end up so downriver
Hmm.
because people think, oh no, we've got to update all our learning materials. It's like, what do you mean update your learning materials? Are you talking about updating the learning experience? Are you talking about ensuring that the learner is having this sort of extraordinarily imaginative experience? And oh no, what we mean is, can you change all of the 30 credit references, or can you make sure that that piece of or can you find a way to patch a video, because when it said Microsoft X, it's now Microsoft Y because that software company has done an update. It's just like, do you know what? That is not the work that you and I signed up to do. That of course it lives in learning design because that's building, but it's so downriver
Hmm.
from the interesting question, which is like, is it possible to design a course where the handover is in the design of the course?
Hmm. Yeah.
You know what I mean? That the ability to that cultivating institutional shelf life is in those very early foundational conversations, because sometimes they don't occur to you. I mean, I've done things, myself, where we had a conversation recently where we built out a course and we did a lot that did as much as we could imagine in that space around ensuring that the videos, for example, and that we're not producing the guarantee of obsolescence. And the one thing that we had agreed was that the course was called a particular name. The course had a name. And so it didn't seem unreasonable for the person in the video to use the name of the course. And in a recent conversation with sort of the team, there was this sort of little wish that the one thing they wish was that the person on the video didn't say the actual name of the course, because the institution in question was having a conversation about which course names are more marketable. And it was a classic thing, like, oh no, now because there's sort of a big idea about let's call it something else, there's a whole suite of resources which now suddenly are problematic. And
Hmm.
that I mean that's just a salient thing, and I think that does live upriver. That
Hmm.
lives in the foundational conversations, because you do not want to be tinkering for the rest of your
No.
adult life, do you? Um,
No.
fiddling with fiddling with slide decks, cutting bits of video out, or making somebody else do that.
No.
I just think that can't be the ambition of learning design, right?
No, I totally agree. So we've done cultivating, so we're moving on to structure next.
It's
What
the separator next.
separates? So what's the shift here? What's next?
Well, so essentially, what we've been doing in the last 3 weeks really is looking at all of the kind of. I think it's about how can you set off on the front foot. It's really about right-footedness. So sense making, trust building, cultivating, it's all about those big upriver questions, which I think take a moment of pause and sometimes a moment of courage to ask. It's a space that you sort of, because it can look like you're slowing things down.
Hmm.
Really, I think you have to. It's a big act of future thinking. All of this is really future thinking. It's like, what do we mean by X? How can we build out to sort of keep the future evergreen? How can we do all of those things? The next personas we're going to get into is when you're actually, let's imagine in the perfect world, those three personas have been enacted. There is a an agreement, a set of principles, a kind of a true north. Of course, what happens next? Learning designers build things. They have to build. So with the separator, what we'll get into is like deciding what you need to build and what you do not. It's about figuring out the difference between everything and the right thing.
Mm.
And I'd absolutely say that in a way it sits in the beginning of build. It's still pretty upriver though, because really the worst thing you can do is give time, money, effort, and value to elements of a learning design experience which are decorative. They're not moving the needle. They're not sort of in the mix. They're not doing anything. So we're going to get into sort of some of our war stories and some of our discussions around, I suppose, really what happens when you roll up your sleeves and when the time starts to make big decisions about what you're putting in front of learners.
Yeah, because and there's some really important stuff in there, both from the learner's perspective, don't build stuff learners don't need, but also from a cost perspective. The huge costs involved in building the wrong thing and the time to fix it. So, yeah, this is still a really upriver piece in terms of doing proper scoping, and before you build anything, figuring out what to build, but just as importantly, if not more importantly, what not to build.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, just if you just an analogy, I mean, you and I have had provisional meetings with um, middlemen, if you like, people who are sort of like agencies who are like seeking to sort of put a learning designer to a client. And we've talked about this before because it makes us laugh, but I just remember a classic example of a brief that we got, and it was full of buzzwords. So I think I think it was health and safety. It was some compliance piece, right? And I think in the sort of the wish list, it had videos, it had animations, it had infographics, it had slide decks. It just had all of the things that someone somewhere thinks will convene a effective learning experience. And it was so clear to you, so clear to me. That call got quite short at the end, didn't it? But it was so clear to me that if someone who was less experienced, someone who was less time on the planet, you could have said, you put your hand up and said, I'll do that, I'll build all of that. And you would have built all of that because they used the word, they were all plural, animations, videos, slide decks. There was this sort of little S on the list. You could have built all of that, built it, whatever. And of course, the money against that scope was absurd, really. But someone younger, sort of more less experienced, would have walked into that space. And I'm telling you now, pretty much hand on heart, that set of assets that would have fallen out of that would have looked lovely, would have looked sort of like they would have been professionally produced. Would they have added up to a hill of beans? I don't know, really. I really don't know, because someone needed to do a separation work there. Someone needed to go, why like that? Why that engagement? So on and so forth. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into that that bit, because learning design can sometimes feel like the worst excesses of AI, which is that, as you say, churning out slide decks, churning out this, churning out that, blah, 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 blah. And we've talked a lot about the Kuleshov effect. We've talked a lot about that idea in cinema, which is the space that exists in the individual's mind. So they look at a piece of content, and something meaning is being created not through the piece of content, not exactly through the learner, but through the sort of the space between them, the negative space. And I think sort of like the separator role is connected to a sensitivity about how much you put in front of the learner, how much time, how much space you give them, when do you give more, when do you give less, and when do you stand up to kind of like I suppose, the cliches of learning design, like the caricatures of learning design. Oh, slide decks need to be in for this reason, or you need to have one of those for that reason, because that's what I don't know, online learning looks like. So we'll have 2 of those and 1 of those.
Yeah, it's almost like standing up to content, isn't it? Because a client will always come to you knowing the content. They know what content they want, because it's easy to figure out what content you want. What's not easy to see is all the stuff that will make that content in any way useful to the intended audience, and that's often the negative space and the bits between the bits and the
That's right.
all of that.
So yeah, so that's what we're going to get into. So really, I don't even want to suggest that these these first 3 personas are sort of in a consultative space, because consultation suggests that it's quite lofty and sort of like in this kind of, I don't know, safe space. But our experience of consultation has always been a much more sort of sleeves up in the space, asking the right questions, because, and I don't know if you can agree with me here, because maybe I'm the selfish one or the self-centered one, but because life is short, and asking the right questions at the right time is as much about you and I looking after ourselves as practitioners of this thing. So we are looking after the learners. We've talked about that's what people expect. We need to build imaginative and bold relationships with clients. And you might say the reason for doing all of that work is to ensure that when we do the work, and when we're cascading down to our learning designers, and we're work, that we feel in control of what we're doing, and that we feel confident in the infrastructure, and that we can see the whole thing. So I would say that it's as much about us, and talking this stuff up and naming these things is about asserting ourselves in those early stages of a project.
Yeah, totally agree. Valuable stuff. We will get into that in our next episode. So tune in next week for Tony and Phil talking about separation in learning design. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you, Phil, as always, for a good lunchtime chat, and have a great week.
Yeah, have a great week.